The frost came early that year, hard and merciless, and by the time the market bell rang over Millbrook Square, the cobblestones were already slick with a silver crust that caught the weak December light. Elinor Hale stood behind the bakery stall, with her hands wrapped in a shawl gone thin at the elbows, watching her breath rise in pale clouds. And she knew before she counted the baskets that there would not be enough. There was never enough anymore. The harvest had failed twice running. The river had frozen before the last barges could bring grain down from the mill towns, and the villagers of Millbrook had learned to measure their days by how little they could survive on, rather than how much they might hope for. She had 4 loaves left. 4, when the queue already stretched past the chapel steps, past old Mrs. Pruitt with her empty basket, past the Dobbs children who stood so still and so quiet that Elinor sometimes forgot children were meant to laugh. She sold 2 loaves in the first quarter hour, taking coin she knew some of these families could not spare, because pride was the last thing poverty allowed anyone to keep, and she would not strip it from them by offering charity where they had not asked for it. But when a man staggered into the square, she saw at once that here was someone who had nothing left to protect, not even pride. He came from the direction of the frozen road that led down from the moor, and he did not walk so much as fall forward step after step, as though his body had forgotten the shape of walking upright. His coat, if it could be called that, was a ruin of dark wool, stiffened with ice, and his boots were split at the seams. He had a beard grown wild and untended, and beneath it his face was the grey-white of a man who had gone past shivering into something more dangerous, that terrible stillness the body chooses when it can no longer afford to fight the cold. Nobody in the square moved toward him. A few turned away, the way people turn from a thing they cannot bear to be responsible for. The bailiff's man, stationed near the well with his ledger and his cudgel, only watched with flat disinterest, for it was his sworn duty that winter to see that no strangers troubled the parish rolls, and vagrants were, by the steward's new order, to be turned out past the millstone bridge before nightfall. Charity, or no charity. Elinor did not decide to move. She simply found that she was already moving, out from behind the stall, her skirts catching frost at the hem, and she reached the stranger just as his knees buckled against the cobbles. He was heavier than he looked, all long bone and starved muscle, and she staggered under the sudden weight of him as she caught his arm across her shoulders. "Here," she said, though he could not yet hear her. "Here now. Up just a little further." The bailiff's man called out that she was to leave him be, that vagrants who collapsed on parish ground were the parish's trouble and not a baker's daughter's, that the new order from the steward's office was plain on the matter. Elinor did not look at him. She had learned, in the 2 years since her father died and left her the stall, and her mother's failing eyes and 2 younger brothers to feed, that there were moments when a woman had to choose between being agreeable and being right, and this was not a morning for agreeableness. "Then you may write in your ledger," she said, not unkindly, for she did not have the luxury of making enemies of men with cudgels, that a baker's daughter broke the steward's order, and that she did it in full view of the square, and that she is not sorry. A murmur went through the crowd, not quite approval, not quite alarm. The sound a village makes when it senses a small rebellion it does not yet know whether to join. She did not wait to find out. She half carried, half dragged the stranger to the low bench behind her stall, and she knelt and unwound her own shawl, and put it over him. And then, because his lips had gone the color of ash, and his hands would not stop their fine, terrible trembling, she broke her last loaf in half, and pressed it into his palms. "Eat," she said. "Slowly, small bites, or it will come back up and do you no good at all." He looked at her then for the first time, and there was something in his eyes that did not match the rest of him, some flicker of astonishment too sharp, and too aware, for a man half frozen and starved past sense. It was gone as quickly as it came, buried again beneath exhaustion, and he took the bread with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it, and he ate like a man who had forgotten what eating was for. "You'll want for that loaf yourself," said old Mrs. Pruitt, who had come nearer now, her own basket still empty, her voice pitched low with something between reproach and wonder. "I'll want less than he does," Elinor said, and did not elaborate, because the truth was that her mother would go without bread that night, and her brothers would have only the thin barley soup, and she herself would not eat at all. And none of that was a thing she meant to say aloud in the market square, where pity travelled faster than kindness ever did. She got him to his feet again once the worst of the shaking passed, and because the bailiff's man was already muttering about the steward's order and the danger of setting precedent, she made the only choice that seemed sensible to her, which was to bring the stranger the short distance to her family's bakery, tucked behind the square on Cooper's Lane, and settle him by the great brick oven, where the last of the day's heat still lingered in the stones. Her mother, half blind now from the fever that had taken her sight in patches 2 winters past, felt her way to the stranger's side and laid a hand briefly on his brow, the way she had once done for every sick child and fevered labourer who came to their door in better years, back when the Hale bakery had been known through 3 villages for its charity as much as its bread. "He'll live," her mother said simply, but barely, and not without care. "What is your name, sir?" The stranger was quiet a long moment, and Elinor watched something pass behind his eyes, some calculation she could not read, before he answered in a voice roughened by cold and disuse. "Aldric," he said. Only Aldric. It was not, though she did not know this yet, the whole of his name, nor even the truest part of it. But she did not press him, for she had learned that men who came to her family's door in such condition rarely wished to explain themselves, and that the explaining could wait for strength enough to bear it. She gave him her own narrow bed that night, in the loft above the bakery where she had slept since childhood, and took a place by the oven's dying warmth herself, wrapped in her cloak with her knees drawn to her chest. Listening to the wind try the shutters, and to the stranger's breathing grow slowly less ragged in the room above, she told herself she had done only what any decent soul would do. She did not yet know that the man breathing easier above her, warmed by the last of her family's bread and the whole of her mother's brief store of goose-grease salve, was Aldric Voss, 7th Duke of Ashworn, master of the very lands the steward's cudgel-bearing man served, and that he had walked out onto the frozen road 3 days before, under a false name and a beggar's coat, because he no longer trusted a single word written in his own estate's ledgers. He had left Ashworn Hall in secrecy, telling no one but his old manservant Pell, because the numbers sent up from the steward's office did not match what his father, dying the autumn before, had murmured to him in his last clear hours. His father had gripped his wrist with a strength that should not have remained in a body so wasted, and said only, "Watch Culver. Watch what he does to the villages, when no one from the house is looking." And then the old Duke had died before he could say more, leaving Aldric a title, an estate heavy with debt from a war he had spent 5 years fighting on the Crown's behalf, and a warning he did not yet understand. Culver's report spoke of a hard winter well managed, of relief distributed fairly, of no unusual suffering among the tenants. Aldric, home only a fortnight, and still raw from grief, and from the things war does to a man's sleep, had found he could not simply trust the ledgers. He needed to see with his own eyes, so he had put on the coat of a dead soldier he had once known, a coat that had seen worse winters than this one, and walked the roads as a stranger, meaning to observe his own lands the way a duke never could, unrecognized, unfeared, unflattered. He had not meant to nearly die in the attempt. The cold had come faster and crueler than he'd accounted for, and pride, that old soldier's habit of believing his own endurance limitless, had very nearly finished what the steward's neglect had started. He understood, lying in the narrow bed above the bakery with the smell of yeast and wood smoke settled into the beams, that he owed his life to a girl who did not know his name, who had broken a magistrate's order and given away bread she could not spare, and who had not once asked what he could give her in return. He woke the following afternoon to the sound of children's laughter, thin and careful the way children's laughter becomes when they have learned to be quiet, and he lay still a moment listening to the household move below him. He heard Elinor's voice, low and patient, instructing someone in the proper way to fold dough so it did not toughen, heard the scrape of the oven door, heard a boy's voice ask if the stranger upstairs was going to die, and Elinor's firm reply that he certainly was not on her watch, and something in Aldric's chest, some old and armoured place, loosened slightly at the certainty in her tone. He came downstairs unsteadily near dusk, wrapped in a blanket over his own half-dried clothes, and found the bakery's back room smaller and poorer than he had imagined from the sounds of it, the shelves half bare, the fire banked low to save fuel, 2 boys of perhaps 8 and 11 sharing a single stool by the hearth, while they took turns with a whittling knife on a scrap of pine. Elinor's mother sat near them with her sightless eyes turned toward the warmth, her hands never still, mending a garment by feel alone. And Elinor herself stood at the worktable, sleeves pushed to her elbows, kneading dough with the steady practiced motion of someone who had done it every day of her life, and would do it every day for the rest of it, unless something changed that she had no power to change. "You should be resting," she said, without looking up, though she must have heard him on the stair. "I have rested enough to be ashamed of how much trouble I've caused you," he said, and meant it, and something in his voice must have carried the truth of that, because she did look up then, and studied him a moment with an assessing frankness he was entirely unused to. In 5 years of war and command, men had looked at him with fear, with calculation, with the careful deference owed to rank. This girl looked at him the way one might look at a fence post to determine whether it would hold weight. "You'll want food before you thank anyone," she said. "There's broth." "It isn't much. It is a great deal more than I had 3 days ago," he said, and sat where she gestured, at the small table crowded close to the hearth, and when she set the bowl before him, he saw that it held less than what she gave her own brothers, and understood, with a clarity that shamed him, that she had thinned her own family's portion again to feed him. He tried, in the days that followed, to repay some part of what he could not properly repay. He had no coin on him, having left every mark of his rank behind at Ashworn Hall, so he offered instead the only currency a beggar has, which is labour. He split wood until his unpractised hands blistered, and then split more once they had calloused. He fixed a hinge on the bakery's back door that had hung crooked for a year. He carried water from the well before dawn, so that Elinor's mother would not have to feel her way across the icy yard. He discovered with something like wonder, entirely unnecessary to the smooth running of this household, and entirely necessary to its dignity. For Elinor had grown so used to doing everything herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to have another pair of capable hands beside her own, and he found he wanted, with an urgency that startled him, to be useful to her in some way that had nothing to do with the vast machinery of his title. It was in the small hours of those first weeks that he came to know her true nature, not through any grand gesture but through 100 small ones. He watched her sell bread below its worth to the Dobbs family, and then quietly absorb the loss herself, telling her mother a different smaller number than the truth, so her mother would not worry. He watched her walk 2 miles in the sleet to bring a loaf to a widow too proud to come to market, and walk 2 miles back with nothing to show for it but cold feet and a satisfied quiet in her face. He watched her face down the bailiff's man a second time, when he tried to confiscate flour meant for the parish poor box, standing her ground with a steadiness that had nothing to do with size or strength, and everything to do with a will that did not know how to bend when bending meant abandoning someone weaker than herself. And he watched her with him, specifically, and found that she treated him exactly as she treated everyone else in her small orbit, which was to say without flattery, without softness she did not mean, without any of the careful calibration people had always shown him once they learned his name. She scolded him for working too hard on a chest still recovering from the cold. She laughed, unguarded and startled, when he made a poor joke about his own uselessness with a broom. She argued with him about whether the second rising of dough needed 1 hour or 2, and would not concede the point even when he pretended, out of some old habit of command, to insist. Nobody had argued with Aldric Voss about anything in longer than he could remember. He found he had missed it terribly, this being simply a man among other people, subject to correction, capable of being wrong. "You watch everything," she said to him one evening, some 3 weeks into his stay, when the household had gone quiet, and only the two of them remained by the banked fire, she mending a torn apron. He pretending to whittle, though his carving was clumsier than her youngest brother's. "You watch the way a man watches who is used to being watched himself, and does not like it." He set down the knife. It was, he thought, a dangerously perceptive thing to say, and he wondered, not for the first time, whether the lie he had told her might already be wearing thin at its seams the way his old coat had. "I have not always lived a quiet life," he said, which was true, and vague enough to survive her scrutiny. "No," she agreed. "I didn't think so. You don't carry yourself like a man who's only ever chopped wood and mended fences. You carry yourself like someone remembering how to be small." She looked at him then, not unkindly, but with the same frank assessment she'd given him that first evening. "I don't ask what you're hiding, Aldric. Everyone who comes through that door in winter is hiding something. Grief or debt or shame or worse. I only ask that whatever you're hiding, you're honest with the people in this house while you're under our roof. That's all I require of anyone." It was, he thought later, lying awake and listening to the wind, the most exacting and the gentlest demand anyone had made of him in years, and he found that he wanted, more than he had wanted anything since before the war, to be worthy of it. He was already, he understood with a kind of quiet alarm, more than halfway in love with her, not with her beauty, though she was lovely in the unadorned way of someone who had never had leisure to consider her own appearance, but with the plain unshowy courage of her, the way she made room in a life that had almost nothing to spare for a stranger who could offer her nothing back. The trouble came, as trouble does in small villages, through a mouth that could not keep a secret. It was young Tomas, the elder of Elinor's 2 brothers, who let the truth slip, though he did not know it was truth when he said it, only repeating a rumor he'd heard from a carter passing through, with news from the county seat, that the young Duke of Ashworn had vanished from his own estate a month past, and was said to have gone half-mad with grief and war nerves, wandering the roads under an assumed name, and that the steward had quietly doubled the watch on the roads for fear something had happened to him. Elinor heard this at the supper table, and looked, for one unguarded moment, directly at the man she knew as Aldric, and Aldric, who had grown skilled these past weeks at reading the shifts in her face, saw the exact instant suspicion crystallized into near certainty, and knew that the lie he had been living was no longer his to control. He told her that night, after her mother and brothers had gone to bed. Sitting across the small table from her, with the fire down to embers, and the whole weight of what he had withheld, sitting between them like a third presence in the room. He told her his true name, and his title, and the reason he had left his own hall in a dead soldier's coat, and the debt he owed his father's dying warning, and he watched her face move through disbelief. And then, a terrible, dawning understanding, and then something that hurt him far more than anger would have, which was a quiet, careful withdrawal, as though she were folding herself smaller to protect some part of herself she had not known was exposed. "You let me believe you had nothing," she said, and her voice was very even, the evenness of someone working hard to keep it that way. You let me give you my last loaf of bread, and my own bed and weeks of my family's food, and all the while you had an entire haul waiting for you, an entire county's worth of grain in your own stores, and you said nothing. I did not know how to say it, he said, without it becoming the only thing you saw when you looked at me. That was not your choice to make for me, she said, and there was iron in it now, the same iron he'd watched her turn on the bailiff's man in the square. I fed you because I believed you were starving and had nowhere else to turn. I would have fed you regardless of your name, Aldric, or whatever your name truly is. But you took something from me by hiding it. You took my right to know exactly who I was giving my last bread to, and what that meant, and you let me spend 3 weeks believing myself equal to a man I was never equal to at all. You were never unequal to me, he said, low and urgent, leaning forward. If anything, these 3 weeks have taught me how far beneath you I have always been in everything that matters. But she was already rising, already reaching for the shawl he had once worn on the bench in the square, wrapping it around herself as though she needed its familiar weight to steady her, and she said only that she needed to think, that she could not sit across a table from a duke who had let her call him a beggar and pretend it changed nothing. And she went up to the loft that was. He remembered with a fresh stab of shame her own bed that she had given to him without a second thought weeks before, and left him alone by the dying fire with the full weight of what he had done. He did not sleep that night. He sat turning the whole matter over, understanding at last the particular cruelty of the thing his father had tried to warn him of, that a man of rank could do harm not only through cruelty, but through the simple failure to be honest with those who had no power to demand honesty of him. And he understood, too, why the reveal had wounded her so precisely where it had, because it was not his title she resented, but the fact that he had let her love a fiction, however briefly, however honestly the fiction had come to feel real to him, when she had given everything she had, unguarded, to a man who had kept himself guarded even at his most desperate. He left before dawn, not because he wished to abandon the matter, but because he understood, with the particular clarity grief and war had taught him, that a wound needed room before it could be tended, and that his presence in that small kitchen was, for the moment, only salt in it. He walked back to Ashworn Hall on legs still weak from his ordeal, and Pell, his old manservant, wept openly to see him alive, and the household erupted into a controlled chaos of relief and alarm that Aldric endured with the patience of a man whose thoughts were entirely elsewhere. He did not, however, forget what he had come to learn. Within a day of his return he called for the full ledgers of the winter relief distribution, and set Pell and 2 clerks he trusted absolutely to cross the steward's figures against the actual grain stores in the estate's own granaries. And what emerged over the following week was a picture far uglier than mere neglect. Culver had been selling the Crown's relief grain, meant for the tenant villages in a hard winter, to merchants in the county seat at a private profit, falsifying the distribution rolls to show grain given to families who had, in truth, received nothing at all, or received it so late and so diminished that half the parish had gone hungry through a winter the ledgers claimed was well managed. It was, Aldric understood with a cold and quiet fury, precisely the sort of quiet, bureaucratic cruelty his father had died trying to warn him against, the kind that never showed itself as violence but only as absence, as bread that never arrived, as children who grew thin while a steward's account books stayed tidy. He confronted Culver in the estate office with the full weight of the evidence before him, and the steward, cornered, tried first denial and then the particular wheedling justification of a man who has convinced himself his theft was merely efficient management, and Aldric dismissed him from his post within the hour, and sent word to the county magistrate that a full accounting would be demanded, that every family shorted through that winter would be made whole from the estate's own stores, regardless of what restitution the law eventually extracted from Culver himself. But even as he set this right, he understood it was not enough, not for Elinor, not for himself. The wrong he had done her was not a matter of ledgers. It could not be fixed by proclamation or by grain delivered to Millbrook Square, however much good that grain might do. He turned the problem over for 3 days, pacing the long gallery of a hall that had never felt so large or so empty, until Pell, with the bluntness of a servant who had known him since boyhood, finally said what needed saying. "You are trying to fix this the way you fix an estate, Your Grace, with orders and restitution and grand gesture." But she did not fall in love with a duke's grand gestures. She fell in love, if I may say so, with a man who chopped wood badly and lost an argument about bread dough. If you wish to be forgiven, you might try being that man again, rather than this one. So Aldric went back to Millbrook, but not as a duke arriving in state with outriders and a gilded carriage, though such an arrival would have satisfied the county's expectations of how a duke ought to behave. He went on foot, in a coat plainer than the one he'd worn as a beggar, but honestly his own this time, and he carried with him no letter of introduction and no announcement, only the truth, which he meant to offer without disguise this time, in whatever form she was willing to receive it. He found her not at the bakery, but in the square itself, where word had already begun to spread of Culver's dismissal and the promised restitution, and where a crowd had gathered in the particular electric hush of a village absorbing news too large for its usual gossip. She stood near her stall, and when she saw him crossing the square toward her, plainly dressed, entirely without ceremony, her face went through the same sequence he had watched 3 weeks before: disbelief, understanding, and then something more guarded, something that braced itself against whatever he had come to say. He stopped before her, aware of every eye in the square upon them, aware that this was not the private reckoning he had imagined, but a public one, and he found that he did not mind, that if the wound he had caused had happened partly in the shame of secrecy, then perhaps some part of the mending needed to happen in the daylight of the same square where she had first knelt over a dying stranger, without asking his name. "I did not come to ask forgiveness with grain or gold," he said, loud enough to carry, though his eyes did not leave hers. "I came because Culver is dismissed, and every family in this parish will be made whole for what was stolen from them this winter. And that is simply justice, owed regardless of what stands between you and me. What stands between you and me is a different matter, and I have no ledger that can fix it. I can only tell you that the man who chopped your wood and lost the argument about your bread dough was not a performance I gave to win your pity. He was the truest version of myself I have been in 5 years of war and grief, and the particular loneliness that comes from never being certain whether anyone around you loves the man or merely fears the title. You saw the man, Elinor. You saw him before you knew there was a title attached to him at all, and you fed him your last loaf without once asking what it would earn you. I have spent every day since trying to understand how I could deserve that, and I have concluded that I cannot, not through any grand gesture, only through trying, every day for as long as you would let me, to remain worthy of having been seen that way once." The square had gone very quiet. Elinor stood with her hands still dusted with flour from the morning's work, and Mrs. Pruitt, near the chapel steps, had gone entirely still, and even the bailiff's man, no longer employed in Culver's service, had stopped to listen. "You let me love a stranger," Elinor said, but there was less iron in it now than there had been 3 weeks before, something softer moving beneath the words. "How am I to trust that what I loved was real, and not simply a man's holiday from himself?" "Because I am asking you now," he said, "not as a duke offering elevation, which I understand you would refuse, and rightly so, but as the man who split your wood and lost your argument, to let me go on being that man beside you, in whatever form that takes, in this square, or in that bakery, or wherever you will have me. I am not asking you to become a duchess, Elinor, though that is what the law would call you if you agreed. I am asking whether the man you fed and nursed and argued with for 3 weeks was worth loving, because I believe he was the realest thing I have been allowed to be since I was a boy, and I believe you are the reason he came back to himself at all." She was quiet a long moment, long enough that the square held its breath with her, and then she looked past him, briefly, to where her mother had come to the bakery door, drawn by the hush of the crowd. Her sightless eyes turned toward the sound of her daughter's silence, and something in that glance seemed to settle a question Elinor had been asking herself since the night he'd told her the truth. "You will still chop the wood," she said finally, and it was not quite forgiveness yet, but it was the door to it standing open, "and you will still lose the argument about the bread dough. Because 2 hours is correct, and 1 hour will always be wrong, your grace or no. I would not have it any other way," he said, and something in his chest that had been clenched tight since the night he left her loft came finally, fully loose. It was not, in the end, a swift reconciliation, nor should it have been, for trust broken by even a well-meant lie does not mend in a single afternoon in a market square, however many witnesses stand ready to call it romantic. Aldric returned to Millbrook not once but many times through the remainder of that winter, and each time he came without ceremony, in plain dress, and did the plain work of a man courting a woman who had every right to make him earn back what he had spent so carelessly, however unintentionally. He mended the bakery roof properly this time, with proper tools brought from the estate rather than borrowed ones. He sat with her brothers and taught them, at Elinor's insistence and clearly to his own private delight, the sums and letters they had never had schooling enough to learn, until young Thomas could read a ledger better than half the estate's clerks. He brought physicians from the county seat for her mother's eyes, not as a lord's charity dispensed from a great height but quietly, through Pell, so that it would not feel like payment for anything. Only like care given, because care was owed to people he had come to love. And it was in the depths of that same winter, when the worst of the cold had not yet broken, and a fever swept down from the moor villages and into Millbrook itself, that the second, harder trial came, the one that would prove beyond any doubt what neither title nor bread alone could prove. The fever took the very young and the very old first, and it took them fast, and within a week half the parish lay ill, including both of Elinor's brothers, and, worst of all, her mother, whose eyes had only just begun to heal under the physician's care, and whose lungs had never been strong. Elinor nursed them all with a ferocity that frightened even Aldric, who had seen men endure terrible things in war, and thought himself hardened to suffering, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat more than a crust at a time, moving between the 3 sickbeds with cloths and broth, and the low, steady voice she used to talk fevered children back from the edge of delirium. Aldric brought every physician the estate's money could summon, brought clean linens and proper medicine, and the estate's own stores of what little food remained wholesome, but he understood, watching her, that no physician's skill would matter half so much as her refusal to let any of the 3 she loved slip away, while she still had strength to hold them. On the 5th night of the fever, with young Thomas's breathing gone dangerously shallow, and her mother burning so hot that the cloths dried within minutes of being laid on her brow, Elinor herself collapsed, her body finally giving out under weeks of insufficient food and days without sleep, and it was Aldric who caught her before she struck the floor, Aldric who carried her to the loft bed she had once given to a starving stranger, and now could not climb to under her own power, and Aldric who sat through the remainder of that terrible night, not as a duke commanding physicians from a comfortable distance, but as a man on his knees beside a narrow bed, holding the hand of a woman he loved and understanding, with a clarity that stripped away every remaining pretense he had ever held about rank and duty and the proper distance between a lord and a commoner, that if she did not wake he would count every honor his family had ever held as worth nothing at all beside her. She did wake, near dawn, weak and hollow-eyed but lucid, and found him still kneeling there, his face grey with the same fear he had once worn frozen, and starving on the market square cobblestones. And she managed something that was almost a smile. "You look," she said, her voice a thread, "like a man who has forgotten how to hope for anything small." "I have been relearning," he said, and could not keep the roughness from his voice. "How much I have to lose." Her mother and both brothers survived the fever, though it took the better part of a month before the household could be called fully mended. And it was Elinor's own recovery that came slowest, for she had given out the last of her strength the way she had once given out the last of her bread, without calculation, without holding anything back for herself. Aldric did not leave Millbrook again during that month. He slept, when he slept at all, in a chair by the bakery hearth, and he learned to bank a fire properly, and to make the thin invalid's broth Elinor's mother favoured, and the village, watching a duke do a servant's work without complaint or announcement, week after week, began to understand that whatever tale had brought him first to their square in a beggar's coat, he had not left it behind so much as let it become the truest part of who he was. It was Elinor herself, once her strength had returned enough to stand at her work table again, who finally raised the matter neither of them had spoken of, since the fever took the household's whole attention. She was kneading dough, slower than before, still weak, and Aldric was beside her at the low stool by the fire, ostensibly whittling. In truth, watching her with the same quiet attentiveness that had marked every hour of his convalescence months before. "I have been thinking," she said, not looking up from the dough, "that a woman who has spent a month watching a duke scrub pots and empty sick-room basins without once complaining of it has very little excuse left to doubt whether his love is real. I would empty every basin in the county," he said, "and count it the least of what I owe you." "I don't want you to owe me anything," she said, and now she did look up, flour-dusted and tired, and, he thought, entirely lovely in the plain unadorned way she had always been lovely to him. "I want you to want this because it is what you want, not what you believe you must pay for what happened in December. I have wanted it," he said, "since the night I first heard you argue with your own mother about how much bread to give the Dobbs children, and understood that you would give away your family's supper before you would turn away a hungry child. I did not know your name that night, only that I had never in my life met anyone whose goodness was so entirely unperformed. I have wanted this since before I knew your name, Elinor, and I will go on wanting it long after every ledger in the county has forgotten Culver's crimes, and every gossip has found some newer scandal to chew over. I am not offering you a title because I owe you one. I am asking you to marry a man who chops wood badly and loses arguments about bread dough, because that man cannot imagine a single hour of his life going forward that does not have you in it." She set down the dough and wiped her hands on her apron, and there was, for the first time since the night of the reveal, no guardedness left in her face at all. Only the same frank, clear-eyed regard she had given him that very first evening he'd come downstairs, wrapped in her family's blanket. The look of someone measuring a man, not by his coat or his name, but by whether he could be trusted to. "Hold wait. Then yes," she said simply, "though I warn you the dough still needs 2 hours, and I will not be argued out of it, husband or no." He laughed, something he had not done freely in longer than he could remember, and crossed the small space between them, and kissed her there in the warm, close kitchen, with the smell of yeast and wood smoke settled into the beams, while her mother, seated by the hearth with her healing eyes turned toward the sound of her daughter's happiness, smiled without needing to see it to know precisely what had happened. They were married in the spring, once the last frost had broken, and the roads to Ashworn Hall stood open and dry, and Elinor insisted, over the mild protests of the county's more traditional families, that the wedding take place not in the grand chapel of the ducal estate, but in Millbrook's own small stone church, the one whose steps had once been lined with a queue too long for 4 loaves of bread. The whole village came, and stood in the same square where a starving stranger had once been carried past the bailiff's objections, and watched a baker's daughter become a duchess, without once ceasing to be, in every way that mattered, the same woman who had broken her last loaf in half, for a man whose name she did not know. Aldric kept his promise about the wood and the bread dough for the whole of their long life together, chopping kindling badly enough that the household staff at Ashworn Hall learned to hide the good axe from him, and losing, every single time, the standing argument about how long dough required its second rising, though Elinor came in later years to suspect he lost it deliberately, for the simple pleasure of hearing her declare herself right. He restored the tenant villages to a prosperity they had not known in a generation, personally overseeing every winter's relief, so that no steward, however trusted, would ever again have the chance to turn hunger into private profit, while a ledger claimed otherwise. And he did this not as a matter of noble duty performed from a comfortable distance, but because he had once nearly died on a frozen road, and had been saved not by his rank, but by a stranger's unasked for mercy, and he never again forgot what that mercy had cost her, nor what it was worth. And Elinor kept her bakery, though she no longer needed the coin it earned, because she said she had spent too many years knowing the exact weight of hunger to ever stand comfortably apart from it, and every winter thereafter, when the frost came hard and the queue grew long past the chapel steps, the Duchess of Ashworn could be found behind the counter on Cooper's Lane, in an apron dusted with flour, breaking bread for anyone who needed it, and beside her, more often than the county's finer families ever quite grew accustomed to, the Duke himself, sleeves rolled to the elbow, losing arguments about dough and meaning every word of his surrender, a man who had once been carried in from the cold by a woman who did not know his name, and who had spent the whole of his life since trying, in every small and unglamorous way he could find, to be worthy of the moment she knelt beside him on the frozen stones, and decided, without needing to ask who he was, that he was worth saving.